I didn't plan to start a weekly event. I just wanted to finish a bag of lemons before they went bad. That's how the whole thing began. On a hot Tuesday in Austin, Texas, when the sky looked like a bright blue plate and the heat pressed on the street like a heavy hand. I lived in a small old duplex 2 blocks from the trail by Lady Bird Lake. On my porch, I set a folding table, a white cooler full of ice, a glass drink dispenser, and a handwritten sign I made with blue painter's tape. Free lemonade, really. I stood there with a stack of paper cups and a nervous smile, like a kid at his first yard sale. I didn't expect anyone. I also didn't expect what happened next. The first person to stop was a jogger with red headphones. She slowed down, breathing hard, and laughed when she saw the sign. "Is it actually free?" she asked. I nodded. She took a cup, tasted it, and gave me a thumbs up before jogging away. I felt strangely happy, like I'd just done something brave. The second person was a mail carrier who said the route felt longer in the heat. He lifted his cap, drank 2 cups, and told me his name was Luis. The third was a mom pushing a stroller, grateful for a cup and some ice for the baby's bottle. I didn't plan conversation, but conversation found me. I told myself I would stay for 1 hour. 2 hours later, the cooler was half empty and my porch had turned into a tiny stage where small moments played out. A bike locked to my railing. A dog named Peanut snored under the table. Someone left a reusable cup and promised to pick it up later this week. I learned that a neighbor named Claire was training for her first 10K and hated hills. A college kid from UT talked about a music theory class that made his head hurt in a good way. A handyman showed me a trick to fix the squeaky hinge on my front door. I wrote the tip on the back of an envelope and stuck it in my pocket like treasure. Around 4, the sun softened but the air was still warm. A man in a crisp shirt stopped by on his walk home. He took a sip, looked at the sign again, and asked why. I said I had lemons and time. He laughed. "That might be the best reason to do anything," he said, and I thought about that line for hours. I stood there refilling cups, watching the color of the street shift as the afternoon slid toward evening. Cars passed. Cicadas buzzed. A breeze lifted the corners of the tape on my sign and made it wave like a flag. Then a small boy in a dinosaur t-shirt came with his grandmother. He took one sip and his eyes went wide. "This tastes like a yellow popsicle," he announced, which was the best review I've ever received for anything I've made. Before they left, he reached into his pocket and put a folded dollar on my table. I pushed it back. "It's free," I said. He pushed it forward again. "It's for next time," he said, serious and small. They walked away, and I stood there looking at the dollar. Next time? I hadn't thought about a next time. As the light turned golden, a neighbor I'd seen but never met brought down a tray of mismatched ice cubes. Some were heart-shaped, some were stars. She introduced herself as Miss Dorothy from the upstairs unit across the street. "I don't drink lemonade anymore," she said, "but I do like people who give it away." She sat on my stoop for a while, telling me about the pecan tree that used to stand at the corner before a storm took it, and how the summer of 2011 felt hotter than this one, and the day she saw the bats lifting like smoke from under the Congress Avenue Bridge. I listened like a student. Her voice had the gentle rhythm of someone who knows a neighborhood like a family photo album. I finally packed up when the streetlights blinked on. I poured the last of the lemonade into a mason jar, put the cups back in the cabinet, and wiped the table with a damp cloth. I held the boy's dollar for a second longer, then slid it under a magnet on my fridge. The kitchen was quiet, but my head was still busy with details. The jogger's red headphones, Luis's route, the baby's sleepy sigh, the star-shaped ice melting into little ordinary circles. Before bed, I wrote in a notebook I kept for small things. Gave away lemonade. Met 10 names I'll remember tomorrow. I drew a lemon next to the words because I'm not an artist, but I like to try. Then I set the notebook on my nightstand and lay there watching the shadows shift across the ceiling. The room smelled faintly of citrus and tape, and the kind of tired you feel after standing in the same spot with purpose. I caught myself smiling in the dark. It felt like I had opened a tiny window in a wall I didn't know existed, and a breeze, unexpected and cool, had come through. The next morning, I woke up thinking about the word next. It waited on my fridge under a magnet shaped like Texas, wrapped around a crumpled dollar bill left by a kid who compared my lemonade to a yellow popsicle. I made coffee and stood at the window, looking at the empty porch outside. It looked ordinary again, but not to me. I rinsed the dispenser and set it back on the shelf, and then, without really deciding, I penciled a note in my calendar for the following Tuesday. Lemonade? I didn't tell anyone. I just wanted to see what would happen if I showed up again. Sometimes, showing up is the whole trick. Sometimes, it's everything. The next Tuesday, I put out the table earlier, around 3, when the air felt like warm bathwater and the pavement shimmered. This time I had 2 dispensers, classic lemonade and a new one with strawberries, because I was feeling brave. I'd also learned a lesson about ice. I bought a giant bag from the gas station and filled the cooler until it looked like winter in there. I made a better sign too, with cleaner letters and a small lemon doodle that actually looked like a lemon if you squinted. I added a line at the bottom. Tuesdays, 3 to 6 p.m. It felt official, but in a soft way. People came. Not a crowd, but more than last week. Luis waved from across the street and promised to return on his way back. The jogger with red headphones showed up and said her name was Bree. I brought my friend, she said, and a second runner smiled with the face of someone deciding to be irregular. A dad with a toddler asked for half water, half lemonade, a trick I now love. A neighbor named Finley brought down folding chairs and left them near my steps with a note. Use these as long as you want. He scribbled a P.S. I'm terrible at sitting, but other people are good at it. By 4, a rhythm appeared. Pour, chat, wipe, refill. A tiny line would form, then dissolve. Someone would lean against my railing. Someone would pet Peanut, who again chose the shade under my table as his office. On the second hour, I ran low on ice anyway, because Austin is ambitious when it comes to melting things. I was about to apologize to the next person when a woman crossed the street carrying a bag of ice like a championship trophy. You're saving my walk, she said. Let me save your ice. She shook my hand with the strong grip of a nurse, told me her name was Priya, and tipped the bag into my cooler while I felt a very specific gratitude that tasted like cold water. At 5:15, the sky changed its mind. A quick gray cloud rolled over, and the first raindrops were fat and warm, like the weather was trying to hug us. I panicked a little. I imagined paper cups collapsing and strangers sprinting away. Before I could move anything, 2 guys from the corner house ran over with a pop-up canopy from the back of a pickup. We use it for tailgates, one of them said. In seconds, it bloomed above my table like a white square umbrella, and the rain switched from problem to mood. People laughed and stepped closer. The air cooled. The strawberry lemonade looked prettier under the soft gray light, and I had the odd sensation that my porch had borrowed a piece of a park. Near the end, a woman I didn't recognize walked up in a green polo with a clipboard and one of those friendly but official smiles. She introduced herself as Valerie from the neighborhood association. My stomach did something small and acrobatic. I braced for a rule. Instead, she said, I've heard nice things. She asked about trash, sidewalk space, and hours. I answered honestly. She nodded, took a cup, and wrote something on her clipboard that made me nervous until she added, This is sweet. Both the lemonade and the idea. She warned me not to block the curb cut and suggested I bring a small trash bin next time. Then she did something I didn't expect. She put a small stack of compostable cups on my table and said, "From our leftover stock. Welcome to the block." When the rain stopped, the street smelled like wet dust and something old and clean. Bree squeezed water from her ponytail and grinned. A musician from upstairs across the way, tall, with a shy wave, brought down a guitar and played a soft, careful song that sounded like a window being opened. Miss Dorothy clapped from the stoop. A kid tried to strum and looked shocked when the string made noise. For a second, everything felt like one of those movie scenes that seems too perfect to be true, except it was just our ordinary Tuesday wearing its best shirt. That night, I was more tired than the first week, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind after you help your friend move a couch and nobody drops it. I cleaned sticky patches from the table and counted cups to see if I'd wildly miscalculated. I found a note under the cooler written in careful block letters. "Thank you for being here." No name, just the words. I put it with the folded dollar on my fridge, under the Texas magnet, like two tiny medals from a small race I didn't know I'd entered. Word started to spread without trying. Someone posted about it on a neighborhood app. I didn't read comments because I like my peace, but I could feel the ripple. The next Tuesday, a yoga group came after class, giggly and sun-flushed, and offered to teach a stretch on my lawn if anyone wanted it. A guy from the bike shop brought a squeeze bottle of chain lube for emergencies and gave me a quick lesson in not ruining my own gears. A librarian told me about a book exchange nearby and asked if I'd host a tiny pop-up shelf sometime. I said yes before I figured out where to put it. A small question started following me around the house like a curious cat. How long can I keep this going? I don't run a cafe. I have a job. I'm not an event planner. But every time the question got loud, I pictured the boy in the dinosaur shirt, the nurse with the ice, the mailbox guy lifting his cap, Miss Dorothy's star-shaped cubes, the canopy appearing in the rain. The pictures made a kind of answer. Keep showing up. Adjust as needed. And bring a trash can. By August, the heat was bossy. The kind that made the air look wavy at 2 in the afternoon and turned every doorknob into a lesson about thermal conductivity. I almost skipped a Tuesday. I stood in my kitchen with the AC whispering and thought, nobody will come. Everyone's hiding in the shade or at Barton Springs. But the calendar square on my fridge had become a promise, and the promise felt bigger than the weather. So I did what I'd learned to do. I showed up. I set a fan by the doorway and a second one on the floor behind the table to push air under the canopy. I froze lemon slices into big rings the night before and floated them in the dispensers like boat wheels. I borrowed a second cooler from Fluently and labeled it water with a marker so bold it looked like a shout. I added a small sign on the porch rail. Take a cup, take a breath, take your time. When the first person arrived, an older man with a straw hat and a steady walk, I felt relief bloom in my chest like cold air from a vent. He introduced himself as Earl and said he'd lived on the block since before I was born. He took a sip, nodded, and told me about the year the oak on our corner lost a giant limb and how neighbors used handsaws and patience instead of calling the city. Took all afternoon, he said. We had a cooler of iced tea, and people kept showing up with sandwiches, like ants at a picnic. After we finished, the street looked different. Not just because of the tree, because of us. He tipped his hat and shuffled to a chair in the shade. I thought about sawdust and sandwiches and how small work in public turns strangers into helpers. Around 4, a high school marching band. Well, 5 kids with brass instruments and courage stopped on their way back from practice. They played a soft, wobbly version of Deep in the Heart of Texas, and everyone clapped off beat and smiling. One of the trumpet players asked if I was charging. I shook my head. He said, "Man, that's cool." The way teenagers say it when something surprises them into respect. Someone put $1 in the tip jar I didn't have. It was the second time $1 appeared at my table without me asking. I pressed it under the same magnet with the first one, because traditions deserve a place to live. Valerie from the association came by with a roll of small trash bags and a sheet of simple guidelines printed in a friendly font. "You're in good shape," she said. "Just keep the sidewalk clear and end on time." She held up a hand before I could worry. "We like this," she added. "It feels like what a block should feel like." She took a cup for the road and waved to Earl, who waved back without standing. I realized they already knew each other, the way roots touch underground. On a late Tuesday in September, a woman I'd never seen before carried up a wooden crate of paperbacks and asked if she could leave a few for a take one, leave one. We moved my plant to make space, and suddenly I had a tiny library. Kids flipped through dog-eared mysteries and thin paperbacks about baseball. Adults discovered cookbooks from the 90s that used a lot of cream cheese. A man found a poetry collection and stood very still while he read a single page. The fan hummed. The ice crackled. Somewhere down the block, someone practiced the same guitar chord again and again until it started to sound like a new language. Not everything was smooth. One week, the strawberries ran out early, and I watched disappointed faces try to be polite. Another week, a gust of wind kicked a stack of cups into the yard, and I learned to weight everything with clothespins. A curious raccoon visited the cooler once and glared at me like I'd interrupted a private appointment. A car parked too close to the curb cut, and I got my first stern look from Valerie, which I thought about for 3 days. But simple fixes existed for almost every problem. More clothespins, a bungee cord, a handwritten arrow pointing to a better parking spot, a small sign reminding raccoons they are not invited, which made 3 people laugh and, I think, 1 raccoon reconsider his choices. The best moment sneaked up quietly. It was near sunset. The light slid across the street in a soft honey color. I was rinsing a sticky ladle with the hose and watching the drops sparkle like small glass beads. An older couple arrived, the woman with a cane, the man with careful hands. I poured half cups for both. "We used to walk this block when our kids were little," the man said. "They'd hop from shadow to shadow and call the dark patches lily pads. We told them the sidewalk was a lake." He looked up at the canopy, at the chairs, at the tiny book crate, at the chalk drawings kids had left earlier. "Feels like the lake is still here," he said, and in that moment I understood the real thing this had become. Not a stand, not a club, not a project. A lake made of people. A place you returned to because it was cool and close and somehow made the day flow different. October arrived with gentler air. Bats lifted like dark confetti from under the Congress Avenue Bridge when I biked home from work. I started bringing a small speaker and played jazz low enough that you could forget it was there until a saxophone suddenly matched your footsteps. The porch smelled like lemons, faintly and always. The Tuesday rhythm felt as natural as trash day, as obvious as sunrise. When my brother visited from Dallas, he stood on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets and said, "You did this." I said, "I just pour." But even as I said it, I knew pouring wasn't the point. On the last Tuesday before the clocks changed, I made a banner from an old sheet that said "See you next Tuesday" in big block letters. People laughed when they saw it because it looked like camp. Bree brought muffins she called recovery cupcakes. Earl wore a new hat and approved of the shade pattern under the pecan. Miss Dorothy told me about the first freeze warning back in '87 and said I should cover my herbs. The band kids had improved. Their deep in the heart claps were almost together now. When it was time to clean up, a handful of neighbors stayed without being asked. We moved like a team that had practiced, quieter than we'd started, sure about where things went. I stacked the last chair, turned off the fan, and stood for a second in the empty dusk, looking at the porch that wasn't just mine anymore. The banner fluttered. The crate of books was thinner. That meant someone found something they needed. A tiny string of battery lights I'd added along the railing blinked once and went still. I felt the kind of contentment that arrives when a thing is both small and enough. Inside, I put the ladles in the sink and leaned against the counter with a glass of water. My fridge held $2, a thank you note, and a calendar full of pencil marks that told the story better than any paragraph could. I thought about all the names I could now say without guessing, and how I used to walk this block like a hallway to my door. Now it felt like a room I shared with people who knew where the good light landed at 5, and which curb broke easily under a bike tire, and when the rain would smell like wet cedar. A map of tiny useful knowledge. I won't pretend it changed the world. It changed my street. It changed me. It taught me the power of an open sign and the discipline of a closing time. It taught me that generosity needs systems, trash bags, compostable cups, a fan pointed the right way, and that systems become habits, and habits become traditions, and traditions become the story a place tells about itself. On my porch, on Tuesdays, between 3 and 6, all summer and a little bit beyond, we practiced being neighbors in public. We poured, we listened, we waved when the bus grumbled by, we offered ice. We learned that a canopy can make a storm friendly. Later that night, I walked down to the lake. The path was quiet. The city hummed its soft electric song. Bats wrote secret messages over the water. I stood on the boardwalk and felt the air move over the surface like a hand smoothing a sheet. I thought about Earl's Lake, the one made of people and chairs and books and a banner painted on a sheet. I thought about the kid with the dinosaur shirt and his $4 next time. I thought about my own first nervous Tuesday and the way a small idea can grow legs if you let it walk. When I turned back toward home, I already knew what the next sign would say once the nights got chilly. Hot cider, really. Tuesdays, of course. 3 to 6. Same porch. Same lake. Same simple reason. I had apples. And time.